thanks for coming out. This is the third and by head count, best attended so far in our speaker series. I'm Sean Murphy, and I direct the Center for Story. You're going to be hearing a lot more about that in the months ahead. But basically, what the center is trying to do is just celebrate storytelling. And one of the ways we do that is just having great discussions with people both inside the university, outside the university, just talking about the intersection of how story is impacting all different types of business and entertainment and art in the culture and in academia. And tonight, I think everyone would agree, this is a topic that we certainly can't cover in 1 hour. We shouldn't cover in 1 hour. And I have a feeling we'll have ongoing discussions, hopefully, about this topic and its repercussions. But I really wanted to fit this in this semester so we could initiate some dialogue. I think by way of introduction, toxic masculinity with a capital T and a capital M manifests in so many ways. I think no matter what your politics, whether you care about politics, in America right now, there's a certain kind of simmering anger. And I'm never satisfied with the media narrative that just says, well, it's because people can't agree and there's just a lot of anger. I think there's a lot of systemic reasons for that. So we're not going to try to uncover and unravel all that. What I want to say at the outset before I introduce Bryan is this is intended to be a very informal and interactive series. So as we go through, if you've got a question or comment, just raise your hand. We're not going to wait till the end. We want to hear from you. We want to make sure that everyone that's here, if you've got a question or concern, that it's addressed. And again, if we leave too much on the table, we'll continue this in the next iteration of this series. But for those of you that don't know, I'm just curious, who doesn't know BPG, our special guest this evening? Everyone knows this guy, right? I'm still going to read his bio because I think it makes me happy to be in the presence of greatness. Bryan Pearce-Gonzales, as many, if not all of us know, is an associate professor of Hispanic studies here at Shenandoah University. He has published critical essays, autobiography, and fiction, has recently published a collection that analyzes the constructions of masculinities in Chicanx and Mexican fictional writings. Dr. Gonzales has 3 fourth-generation Mexican-American children that he and his wife are raising bilingually. And among many services to his community, Dr. Gonzales is currently the chair of the Winchester Public Schools Board. So I want to just turn the mic right over. You wrote a book, so why don't we start there? And you can talk about the particular expertise that you bring to this topic, and then we can riff from there in terms of like, what's changed since you wrote this, what still needs to be addressed, et cetera. But you're here. We can learn a lot from you. I can learn a lot from you. So talk a little bit about why you wrote that book and what it's about.
Thank you so much. And I appreciate the introduction. This vein of study, when you're an academic, I think, you go through these, at least in my experience, I go through these evolutions of things that I'm academically interested in researching. And at a conference, maybe at this point, 6 or 7 years ago, I bumped into an ex-professor of mine. She was my dissertation director when I was getting my PhD. And we had lunch together, and she asked me what I was researching, and I told her I was very heavy into some, French feminist thought at the time. And so then I returned the question, and she told me that she was doing masculinity studies. And it wasn't something that I had ever imagined that I would get into. But she, immediately following that conference, she sent me, because she's great, she sent me an email with like, I don't know, 20 different articles, and I just couldn't put it down. I was reading it, and when I read theory, and when I read, social theory in particular, gender theory, I'm constantly thinking of stories, to bring it back to stories. And so I'm like, wow, this particular thought really makes me think about this one book that I read, or this one film that I saw, reminds me of that story. And so I started putting pen to paper, and I churned out, I don't know, 2 or 3 articles and presented them and published them. And then At another conference, somebody approached me and said, "Hey, this is the second or third time I've seen you present on this particular area. I want to put together an edited volume of essays that deal with this. Are you in?" And I was like, "Oh, sure. Well, yeah, let's do it." And then 2 years later, this book came out. I lent it to a student, and I can't remember who it was, upstairs in my office, and it was not returned. And I'm not even mad about it. Like, steal the book, right? Like, steal the book for all I care. But I had to go to the library to check this out because I no longer have a copy of my own book. So that's how I kind of got into it. I agree. Toxic masculinity, that's kind of the hot button, I don't know what you call it, term that people kind of gravitate towards when anybody thinks about masculinity. I would stress that that's one piece of many different masculinities. It's a very Western concept. In other words, it's prevalent in Western societies, this idea of toxic masculinity. I'm sure it's present in many other societies, but the way that we're using it tonight is a very Western idea.
Yeah. So to break it down, and we don't want to strain like tying it to story, but if you've heard me talk, and the kind of the mission of the Center for Story is to integrate the idea that everything is story. If you break it down, whether you're seeing an ad on TV, or if a lawyer is winning a court case, or a product being sold, or of course a book's being written, these are all narratives, are all stories. And I think when we talk about masculinity, particularly in America, one of the things we have to unpackage is that none of these behaviors are natural. And forgive me in advance but sometimes you just have to make sure like we're using the right terminology. But the notion that there's an inherent maleness that we just have, and that these, in some cases or in many cases, aren't taught behaviors, learned behaviors, inherited behaviors. I think to get any kind of handle on when masculinity is toxic or bad, or will we see manifestations of masculinity that are leading to not good results or good dialogue or connection, very often it's behaviors that have been reinforced for the wrong reasons. Why does that happen historically? How has that happened? And Bryan, what's your take on, how are we teaching, as men, as teachers, as parents, how have we been teaching, and, historically, the wrong lessons? Because I think it's safe to say in 2024, it's way overdue, but we're starting to break out of some of these paradigms. But we have to go back decades, centuries to like learn behavior about violence and aggression. How has this manifested, and what have you seen, like, when you've studied deeply?
Something you said earlier made me think of one of the ways it's manifested is, and when I teach my class on this subject, we often talk about emotional responses. What emotions are available to quote unquote men, right? Men socialized to be masculine. And so we go down that road of, big boys don't cry, and it's not manly or masculine or whatever adjective you want to throw in. It's not macho to, I don't know, to be affectionate with someone else, or things like that. And so then from that conversation, I try to steer the students into, okay, well then what emotions are available to men, quote unquote men, right? Men who adhere to some sense of masculinity. What emotions are available to them? And then we start examining things like anger, frustration, rage, and all the different iterations of that, and how they manifest in our own lives. And I tell my students when I teach this class, and I haven't taught it, I need to teach it again now that I'm talking about it, because it's super interesting to me, and I think the students get a lot out of it as well. But I have my students do this weekly assignment, and it's not graded or structured in any real way, but I have them pay attention to their own lives and come back next week with a story, because I know you've got one. Just pay attention to a story in which toxic masculinity presents itself in your life as you're going about your day to day, and share it with the class. And man, I have heard some of the wildest stories about boyfriends, about, my hallmate down the hall got into a fight with his roommate and it was over whatever it was. And the stories come out and the students in the class are like, that it's insane that the response, the emotional response would be what it was. But but it is. And so we try to use the classroom discussion to analyze those ways. And I try to tell them going forward, point it out when you see it. Talk to people about it. Something that my students realize throughout the conversations of this particular course is that many times, maybe the majority of the times, it's mothers who perpetuate these notions of toxic masculinity. And I've heard it from my peers who happen to be mothers, teaching not only their sons, but their daughters about what masculinity is, and teaching a very toxic sense of masculinity. My high school teacher, who I love and adore, but she used to tell stories of how she wouldn't let her daughter play soccer because, and she comes from Spain, but anyway, she wouldn't let her daughter play soccer because you will get big muscly legs, and that's not feminine, and that's, you will look like a boy, you will look like a man. And so it's these reinforced from our parents. And I think a lot of times mothers, probably because of toxic masculinity, fathers were not allowed to be present emotionally for our kids. And so it's the mothers that teach these stories. And that's always shocking for my students to learn. And then they start examining their own relationships and conversations with their mothers, like, oh my God, my mom told me this one time. We share it as a class, and it becomes one of those more like enlightening moments.
Thank you for that. Yeah, I think to bring it back to story, I mean, we're talking about even within families or within behavior patterns, there's the societal pressure. So we're not even necessarily talking about deeply held personal or familial beliefs, but this notion of, well, we have to raise our boy or our girl a certain way because this is what's expected of society. So what I'm obsessed with is the idea of, yes, you want to counter those narratives and break down the myths, but sometimes the most powerful way to do that is with better, different stories. Um, so I'm curious, like, so when I was your all's age, I think Bryan and I are of a similar generation. When we talked about these things in the previous century, it still tended to center around violence. So we were, bullying is not good. Fighting doesn't solve problems. And that was a very necessary conversation, but it was still very surface level. And what I think we're starting to realize as a society is when we talk about toxic behavior, yes, we can and should emphasize it's not acceptable to use power to hurt other people. But what I think we're seeing as the data rolls in and a new generation that's more empathetic is emerging is that, these behaviors are self-defeating. So not only is this not contributing to society in a positive way, but people that are perpetuating kind of toxic behaviors, not feeling emotion, not being vulnerable, not being empathetic, not being curious about other people, that's limiting the individual in the ways that they can learn and make friendships, build meaningful relationships. So I think we're making progress. But we're still trying to understand how do we open up dialogues in terms of teaching new behaviors. So, Bryan, as a teacher and a father, what are some of the challenges you see? Because I think we would all agree the 21st century is a better environment to have these conversations. But like I said at the outset, there's so much anger that the violence is maybe more online. It's maybe not as physical as it was in my youth, but there's still violence. So what are some ways that you're either countering this, or what are some obstacles you're still seeing even in a more kind of empathetic environment?
Um, I don't know that I have a great answer to that question. If I had a great answer, maybe I would be out there doing it right now, and maybe we are doing it right now by holding an event like this. Um, I don't know what effect I have on my students, but I try to always recognize this being Teacher Appreciation Week and Nurse Appreciation Week. I'm very reflective right now, and what I try to model for my students in my classroom, equity, that every perspective matters, every voice matters, and I was recently in a situation where there was a room full of men, maybe 12, 13 men and two women. And I was supposed to be facilitating this conversation. And if you can imagine, the two women were being very quiet. And like, I don't know, it rubs me the wrong way. And the men were, I don't, my reading of the room was that the men in the room weren't even really aware that the women weren't talking, because the men were just talking, 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 talking. And I try to create that space. I try to call attention to it, and I did. And I try to do that all the time. If I notice that happening, I'm hyper aware when there's an imbalance in power in certain spaces, whether that's beyond racial lines or gender lines or other ones. And I try to call that out and examine that. But you asked me about being a father, and I have a son who happens to, he's only 14, so I assume he's heterosexual. I think he's cisgender. We haven't had those conversations yet. He doesn't probably even understand those terms yet. But I know he likes girls, and he's very athletic, and he's got that male adolescent bravado that, walks out around. He's taller than me now, which was like the biggest deal of his life. When he was that much tall, he's like this much taller than me now. But when he was that much, he started looking down at me, which is a very hyper masculine. So I call him out when he starts doing shit like that. I'm like, listen, fool, I'm still your dad. Good for you that your molecules are expanding at a rapid rate and you're now taller than I am, but I'm still your dad. But we try to educate him, particularly, and I'm not even sure that this is correct, but there's no parenting handbook. So it's him that I worry about more than my two daughters, only because society gets a hold of these kids and does with them things that we as parents don't really have any control over. So he happens to be athletic. He happens to be quite good at the sport he has chosen to play. This has brought him, 14-year-old popularity and 14-year-old social capital in the little world that he lives in middle school. And I hope that I am modeling for him an appropriate way to what expend that social capital. You don't pick on people, and if you see somebody being picked on, if you stand up for that person, it's likely everybody in your little social bubble will either lay off, or they'll say, oh, Joaquin's right, we shouldn't be picking on, something like that. But I don't know. There's, like I said, if there were clear rules of how to do this and do it well and do it efficiently, I think we'd all be about the business of doing it. I'm just trying to do the best that I can by modeling it for my students and modeling it for my kids. But I will say, and I don't know that it's right, I am particularly conscious of modeling it for my son.
That's great. So I have a class. In fact, one of my students from the class, Jace, is here tonight. Thanks for coming. I had a real, not teachable moment, a learnable, I don't know if that's a word, learnable moment. We were talking about generations, and I made what I thought was, well, it was definitely an innocent and well-intended remark that had a kernel of truth. And I said something along the lines of, when I was your all's age, when I was in high school, bullying was like, and I was definitely, as you probably can imagine, like I wasn't a jock, but I was popular enough. So I didn't go through high school afraid, but the idea of being beaten up was like, that was always a thing. And I feel like in the 80s, it wasn't accepted in society, but it was like understood, like boys will be boys is a ridiculous expression that used to get tossed around by teachers. And I made the comment in class, well, I think we've made progress, and you guys maybe don't have to worry about it, because societally that is completely unacceptable. Not saying it doesn't happen, but it's now completely unacceptable for bullying. And all the students in the class said, well, yeah, but there's different types of bullying now. And we started talking about social media. We started talking about the different ways, toxicity. So here, of course, we're not necessarily talking about male, right? But toxicity has adapted And that horrified me. Again, I'll raise my hand and say, yes, I'm that guy. I was old and out of touch, but I'd like to think I'm not out of touch. I just don't think I appreciated the extent to which toxic behaviors, even if they're not necessarily modeled, are so pervasive. That made me realize, in terms of telling better stories and modeling better behaviors, we do have a lot of work to do. So I don't know if I want to show of hands, but I'm curious, like, what's the read of the room? Like, does that resonate with you guys? Like, yeah, bullying is still a thing, and it absolutely needs to be addressed. I mean, are we feeling that? And general agreement. I mean, again, I don't want to make any assumptions, but I'm just saying, I'm not implying that in the 80s bullies got away with it. I mean, you got punished, but there was a sense of like, well, that's just how guys are. And I think it's safe to say that that's completely, from a administration on down, would never fly. But it scares me and kind of horrifies me that, okay, well, people maybe aren't afraid of physical violence, but there's all kinds of other violence. Um, Maybe we can get some thoughts if anyone has anything to add to that. But Bryan, me bringing that up and kind of like the battlefield as maybe we saw it 10 years ago, I think has gotten deeper and darker. Um, and I know we're doing our best, but how does that complicate things when we're talking about behaviors that are not really black and white? Like, oh yeah, you can't hit, the other student.
Yeah, well, I think you touched on it with with the advent of social media and the way that children in particular, from young kids up through adolescence, are interacting with each other, even college students, maybe, I don't know. Maybe there's bullying happening at Shenandoah University. But the fact that I don't know, I think, speaks to the question that you're asking. It's much more clandestine now. It can happen in ways and in spaces that are not out in the open anymore. In the 80s and the 90s, you might see a kid get shoved into a locker, or, all those cliched type of thing. You watch a movie from the 80s or 90s, you'll see what I mean. But that stuff actually happened. I remember in my high school, kids being bullied. But now I'm just not, I think it's, I don't know. I don't want to qualify it by saying it's worse, because it's not worse. I think you're right. It has evolved, but it's evolved in such a way that a lot of times the adults, they don't know about it anymore. I do serve on the school board. And so there are moments that it comes to the attention of the board that there's an incident going on, and 100 times out of 100, it has to do with social media. That's where these interactions are happening. I'm not sure if there's a sense of like, maybe a false sense of anonymity. Like, if I do this to Sean on social media, then I can't get in trouble for it. I'm not sure, but that's where I think it's happening in my very limited experience with bullying in the 21st century. That's where I believe it happens.
Yeah. Yeah. So what are we missing? Does anyone have any thoughts along those, or a question or a comment about bullying, the online experience? What are we as teachers and adults maybe missing? Are we still like way too high level, or can we all kind of be in agreement that these are problems that exist? There are behaviors that we can point out are destructive, occasionally self-destructive, but we just need to counter it with awareness and education. And anything that I'm missing?
You guys are much more in tune with the bullying of nowadays than Sean and I are.
You guys are like, I didn't come here to present. We want to make sure you're heard, and we want to learn and contribute to the discourse. How about show of hands? Who witnesses toxicity? Again, male certainly, but like just toxic behaviors. Who would say that that's something that needs to be addressed at Shenandoah?
Depends on how you're defining bullying, right? Like, how are you defining bullying? Like, are you defining it with harassment? Because if we're like measuring what's changed or how much has changed, there are so many mediating variables depending how you conceptualize that concept and what marginalized groups are talking about, right?
That's a great question, and I'd love to unpack that a little bit. I guess what I would say is I think what we're trying to get to, right? Because Bryan and I could sit up here and enjoyably talk about like what we've seen and but I want to try to get at the real heart of like what's impacting students right now. And I think, as a teacher and advocate for, all the, I hope all the right things, I recognize that it's not good enough to just say, well, we try to model the right behavior and we reinforce positive behavior, but part of the college experience and then part of the life experience is meeting different people, feeling like you can be vulnerable, feeling like you can learn, extend empathy, have empathy shown to you. So if there are ways in which that's not happening, we need to be aware of it so that we can figure out ways to talk about it, and bring it out into the open. So yeah, maybe bullying, I maybe that's too broad, but just harassment or behaviors that somehow still sneak under the radar and are kind of brushed under the carpet as just like, oh, that's how students are. Like, I'm not satisfied with an environment where, that still happens. But I saw, some hands, like it is an issue that needs to be addressed. Is there anything in particular that anyone sees on a regular basis that they wish could be addressed? And again, I'm not talking about your own personal, but just in general, like what are we seeing that are some of these toxicities that could be better addressed?
I don't want to take the mic from somebody else who wants to say something. So raise your hand if you want to answer. But this makes me think of something that we deal with every year in the public school system. So it's not a university level, it's not a higher ed level issue necessarily. Maybe it is to a degree, but it's a middle school level issue every August. So it's coming up in a couple months once the summer's over. It's still hot as hell outside. And there are dress codes in public schools. And 100 times out of 100, it's girls, women that are being dress coded. And as a school board member, we get all the emails from the parents that say, my daughter was wearing an appropriate blah, blah, blah. And for a while, I think I was the only one irritated about this. And finally, I don't know, too many of these came in, and it was monopolizing too much of our discussion time talking about this dress code. And I finally got pissed off because I saw it through this lens of, this is again adults trying to socialize our young people on lines of gender roles and gender conformity. And if you're a girl, you need to, none of our boys are getting dress coded. And they'll come back, well, it's because boys wear short sleeve shirts. And I said, oh, okay, fine. I don't care what the boys are wearing. In fact, I don't care what the girls are wearing. You care what the girls are wearing. Well, it's going to be a distraction to all the boys. Have you ever been around a 6th grade boy, a 7th grade boy? And I was like, yes, I have a son. And I tell you what, if it's my son acting up in a class because he sees the bra strap of the girl that's sitting in front of him, kick my son the F out of class and reintroduce proper behavior lessons to him, how to interact with his peers, because it is not the girl's fault. Sorry, I'm getting like really passionate about this. Wait till August comes around and I start getting more emails. I get like really heated. But I really, advocate on behalf of our young women who, especially at that age, my God, I have my own kids that are growing like weeds. I can only imagine those short shorts that are short today, maybe 2 months ago, they fit that child perfectly. But because they're growing so quickly, but it's the adults and it's women teachers, and we can talk about the gendering of the profession of teaching all day long, because that's another problem. But I go back to, it's not always men that are perpetuating toxic masculinity and these ideas, these kind of outdated ideas of what boys and girls should be and what men and women should be. It's the adults, it's the women that are doing this. Not only men do it too, don't get me wrong, but I try to call that out as often as I see it. So I see that happening in the schools. It's not a form of bullying, but I do see it as a form of harassment. You're pulling a young lady out of classroom instructional time because you think that she's not appropriately dress, and then they'll say shit like, well, are we just gonna let girls come to school in bikinis? I'm like, oh my, I can't even talk to you right now. Like, that's the dumbest hypothetical question of a woman wouldn't show up to work in a bikini. My God, like all eyes would be, the self-consciousness that would be there, and that, but these girls think that they look okay when they leave the house. Let them feel like they look okay all day long. And if a boy is doing something, harassing a young lady, then yank that boy and give him some lessons on how to behave appropriately in social settings. Sorry, I went on a little rant there.
That was beautiful. It was beautiful. So that makes me think, like, so the class I'm teaching this semester has taken a look at the 20th century decade by decade. And one of the things that we're learning, which should seem obvious, is obviously what's acceptable one decade is completely out of style or unacceptable following decade. So I think when we talk about these things, like a notion of history and how history changes perceptions, that's paramount. But again, I think when I alluded at the beginning, at the outset, maybe going back out into maybe a more macro view, I talked about what I perceive, and I'm sure I'm not alone, as this simmering anger where people want to disagree and be disagreeable. I mean, I'm always happy to bring politics into it, but we don't even need to get political to just say, I think one of the buzzwords in our society right now is woke and the pushback to woke. And to me, when I hear that, while there's a lot to unpack there, what I see is there's a certain paradigm in place that doesn't want anything to change. And that happens every generation. But I think we're getting some extreme pushback from people that are not comfortable seeing us break out of some of these more toxic, seeing dress code challenged or expanded, seeing gender roles diversified, seeing younger people be able to speak for themselves. There are a lot of people that are uncomfortable with this, and there's nothing natural about that. The pushback to woke, again, without even getting into political issues, is these are people that want things a certain way for very personal reasons. There's nothing natural about saying, well, now everyone's woke, because that's basically saying everyone has empathy and everyone understands that everyone is important and that a certain type of person, whether it's a white male or just dudes, aren't in charge anymore. There's still a large sector of society that has a problem with that. And so when I get optimistic about the future, I see this generation pushing back hard against that and leading by example and saying, we're claiming our space. I don't know where I'm going with this so much as to say, when I think about woke, I see that through the filter of that's toxicity. The whole argument about, because what are these people really saying other than, I don't want everyone to be sensitive. I don't want to have to be respectful of other people. I used to have the privilege to be racist or sexist, and I was reinforced because society just said, that's the way guys are. That's the way bosses are. Bosses talk that way. That's no longer acceptable. So we're seeing, on a day-to-day level, a lot of resentment and anger. And Bryan, I'm sure you see that everywhere from the school board to, our elected leaders to just this dialogue that we see on the news all the time, where it's one side versus the other, where I think a more positive story, and I think we're making progress there, is woke needs to be reclaimed. Maybe we need different words, or we need to show why woke is good, as opposed to woke being a statement against something that's already been there. We're reclaiming a toxic environment and trying to make it more inclusive.
Yeah, I was listening to the radio recently to a station out of Prince George's County, hip hop and rap station. That's my jam. And there were some African American DJs, and they were talking about you can't say woke anymore. And to one of the other DJs, there's three of them, to one of the other DJs, and the other DJ was like, "What are you talking about? I can't say woke. When did this happen?" Like that, and that's how it happens. There's not like a bulletin that comes out. It's like you got to stop saying it. It's just a sense that people kind of get. Now their conversation was about something else, about the racial claiming of that word. It comes out of white culture. At least these three African American DJs felt that, and so that's why they wanted to refuse or avoid using that term. But Yeah, I don't know what to say about that either. Other than to say people do fear change. The older I get, the more aware I become of that. I live with my in-laws live with us. And before I came here, they went to the Nationals game in DC. And before I came here, this might make the college students in the room chuckle a little bit. But my father-in-law, who's in his 70s, texts me and he says, "Hey, I forgot to set the DVR to record, I don't know, Jimmy Kimmel or something. Can you set the DVR to record it?" And like, we don't need to record things anymore. But he doesn't understand that. And so it doesn't matter how many times I teach him about on demand and you can stream it. And like, as soon as it airs, you can watch it again. He doesn't, it needs to be stored somewhere that he can access. That's the kind of the mentality that he comes from. And they often tell me and Melissa, my partner, they often say things like, you know, it is scary getting old. And what I think they're trying to say is that the world is changing and things are happening that they don't understand anymore. And I use technology as kind of a silly example, but I see it in the same way that you're talking about this term woke. It is a thing. It's not going anywhere. It means being aware. It means being empathetic. People are not going to stop being aware. People are not going to stop being empathetic to the things that other people are dealing with in this society, but it challenges those long held notions of privilege and well, this is the way that I was brought up. And in education you hear that all the time. Why aren't we teaching the kids cursive anymore? I'm like, are you serious? That's the hill you want to die on? Like, okay, I'm not going to say learning cursive is bad. That's not what I'm about. But do you know what our students are now learning that you didn't learn when you were in school in the 70s and 80s? The list is a mile long. Sorry, I lost my train of thought. People are just so resistant to that change that I don't know if I should tell this story, but I got yelled at. So that during the last election, I was running for my seat on the school board. And, as one does, I was sitting out of the polling station at my table with my signs and my stuff. And this woman approached me and she started the conversation nicely, pleasantly. And she said, "I Googled you." And I said, "Oh, wow, interesting. What did you find out?" And she's like, "Well, I just have a really important question." And I don't know exactly how she framed it, but her tone turned very angry to get to that point that you were trying to make. There's an anger, like a very right beneath the surface anger that is very easy to tap into in our society right now. And she said something to she was questioning trans identities and stuff like that, but she was not coming from an intellectual place. She was coming from, I'm 60 some years old, and how can a a boy be born a boy and now the boy is a girl? And I said, no, you're conflating sex and gender, and those are separate things. What do you mean we're talking about chromosomes here? I said, ma'am, you are definitely not going to change my mind in this conversation. I don't think I'm going to change your mind in this conversation. I've dedicated a large portion of my career to doing this research and reading this theory and all that kind of stuff. If you just want to yell at me, by all means, continue yelling, but I'm going to go back to my seat over here. And then she just kind of turned away and stomped away. But people don't like their worldviews to be challenged. And so if you were raised believing the world works in a certain way, and now this generation, what are they calling you guys? Gen Z or something? What are you guys? Gen Z? Okay, so this Gen Z, 10 years ago was the millennials. All the old people were mad at the millennials. Now they're mad at, okay, Logan's a millennial. Now they're mad at the Gen Z. Oh, it's Gen Z's come in and now it's trans this and it's trans that. I mean, I saw a couple of political ads for the governor of West Virginia. That's like 10 miles away. Some of us have seen these ads. And it's the most, xenophobic, unintellectual understanding of what gender is. And those ads are, he's yelling at the camera. But he's basically asking for your vote through this anger, through this rage that he's expressing. And I'm just like, that's where we are right now as a society. But the woke thing is not going away. Maybe like any other term, it's out of style to say that, but the sense of it, I think, is still there. My students express wokeness, and we talk about wokeness. Maybe we don't call it that in class, but it's there.
Yeah. Yeah. Absolutely. And insist on it.
Thank you. And the toxic masculinity I've experienced was much like what you. Deal with that, because I was at a multi-generational gathering, and a young man just not stop. And I think the adults that I'm comfortably at, how do you teach that engagement?
I'll take a quick shot and then I'll let the expert. I'll just say that part of it, and I just caught myself. I never would say lead by example, but what I mean by lead by example is teach. We embrace what we've been talking about. So the classroom conversations should always revolve around the idea that history is changing, progress is good, and that progress in America has traditionally been extremely slow. It's almost like the last resort. But if we look through the lens of like decades and even centuries, women used to not be able to vote. So are we where we need to be in terms of our misogynistic culture? Of course not. It's a work in progress, but like we can note that there's been progress. And what I was going to say to BPG's point is that, and I think it's already clear, but just to put a fine point on it, any kind of change, whether, and I have to say woke, but I just mean the phenomenon of the pushback. There's always going to be pushback. And in America, most progress comes with pain. It's very seldom that people say, you know what, being racist it is really dumb. Like, why are we doing that? It has to be fought for. Women belong in the home. I mean, 50 years ago, you heard that kind of crap. So I tend to be optimistic in the sense that, as Dr. King said, right, the narrative arc bends toward justice. I mean, it's always too slow, but we're getting there. So in a weird way, how I'd answer part of your question is, I actually think at a school like Shenandoah, and one of the reasons I adore this place is that is inculcated in the classroom. It's a tolerant environment. So we're actually probably doing good to teach students, you better be ready to enter a multicultural, non-sexist, non-racist, non-toxic world, because that's how the world is. Now the corporations understand there has to be inclusivity. So if you're graduating from college, wherever you are, and you think that you can kind of bulldoze your way, you're going to be in for a rude awakening. So I'm not saying we don't need to do that work here, but I think that Shenandoah as an institution prioritizes inclusivity, a safe, positive learning environment. So I'm less concerned on this micro level, but I think by talking about how progress is slow, and the other point that I would just make before I pass the mic is that I also try to impress upon anyone of your generation that I talk to that when we hear these political ads and the pushback on woke, that's trying to energize a certain type of voter that reliably votes. And part of the toxic culture we live in, the number one goal, whether we want to call it the powers that be or the men, it's usually men, the white men at the top, or traditionally at the top of the pyramid, they want nothing more than the youth to feel like it's all the same. Government is BS. I'm checked out. They don't want you to vote. They want the young generation to be disaffected and disengaged. They're very afraid of a young generation that votes, and you all, the power that your generation has by saying, we don't care about gender and we don't care about race. I can't believe you guys were hung up on that crap. That's beautiful. But this older guard is like, we want to hold on to our stuff the way it used to be. So if we encourage you guys to understand the power you have and to use that love to change the world, that's going to make a difference. So lest that sound too optimistic, that I feel very good about the local environment, and the people that we need to teach are the people that are responding to the ads we're talking about, saying, yeah, that guy's speaking my language. That's the work I think we need to do.
No, I would echo a little bit of what Sean said. I mean, sometimes it's the students that teach us a little bit about this, because they're not hung up on it the way that maybe our generation was, or the baby boomer generation was. They're, you know, the incoming freshman will have already been introduced to infinitely more trans people than I was when I was coming into college in 1995. You know what I mean? It's already kind of normalized for them. They understand I don't want to trivialize it away that there's no issues that we still need to solve. There are, but I do believe that at least the students that I see, and I have to acknowledge, the student who happens to take an upper level Spanish class that deals with gender, gender issues, gender studies, likely comes to that class already having, I don't know, an open mind, if you will, open to learning new things. But to get to your question about your brother, we are very focused at Shenandoah University on tackling difficult conversations and teaching our students how to have difficult conversations. In fact, there's a whole program here called Shenandoah Conversations, where we teach students tools to use when they're engaging in a very difficult, perhaps very confrontational conversation. We teach them listening skills. We teach them wokeness, not apathy, empathy. Sorry, not apathy. We teach them to value multiple perspectives. There's a downside to that I've always kind of struggled with myself. And I don't know, it's kind of inherent in DEI work, diversity, equity, and inclusion. If you're going to include everybody, then are you including the exclusive people? Are you including the perspectives that are discriminatory, the perspectives that are racist or sexist or classist or whatever that might be? I still struggle with that myself. I think it's an inherent paradox in that, and the work that gets wrapped up in. But yeah, I guess that's my answer to the question. But again, we try to model that, because sometimes we hear stuff in a classroom. I'm looking at Professor Jana's here, and Professor Jones is here, and Professor Coker's here. Like, we hear stuff in classrooms every once in a while, and I have to imagine that we approach those with a lot of empathy. You're raising, is that because you have a question? Okay, Dr. Coker.
When I walked in, we're talking about bullying, and most of the conversation around masculinity, from what I heard so far, is around concepts of aggression, bullying, and a statement and then a question. I'm just messing with you, but so I have a daughter who's a senior in high school, and I can tell you from experience, and Bryan, looking at you too, I know of no other vicious set of people than teenage girls. I mean, they can be horrible. They can be vicious in their bullying. They can be intolerant. And so my question for you is, I guess it's twofold. One, what does masculinity look like to you when it's not toxic? And then secondly, is there such thing as toxic femininity?
I'll go brief, because I want to let our guest, the expert, weigh in. I'll take it in reverse order, because I'm glad you asked, because I had actually jotted down. not to make it about me, but just to locate like my own kind of perspective. Because again, I think this is important to underline. I don't give myself credit. I was fortunate to have, a father. And it's interesting, right? Because my dad is an old school Irish Catholic Boston blue collar boy, but he was brought up right. So when I was a kid, good sportsmanship would like legit, not just saying that. Like he didn't care if we won, but if there was gloating or if you had to cheat to win, like that was unacceptable. Violence not acceptable. Like so, I was modeled, in a positive way. So I was put on a good path. So rather than be smug about that, I'm very humble about. I was lucky, that gave me actually an advantage as I started assimilating into school. But with that backdrop, then when I saw certain teachers or coaches, priests, professors, like you both learn from those that you want to emulate, but you also it can be very powerful to see the examples of what you don't want to be and say, I'm seeing this and I don't want to be like that. And Jeff, to answer your other question, first of all, toxic masculinity, and Bryan put it perfectly earlier. It's like you almost have to do this because it's like it is a buzzword, but you could just say masculinity or toxicity, but it's a way to locate the conversation. I would just offer that we're also talking about toxic behavior that comes often at the root from misguided notions of like men are tough, men don't cry. But I think 100% can females be toxic? I think it would be sexist to say no, because women are inherently nicer. Like, I think there's different manifestations of these toxicities, but what they ultimately boil down to is some kind of exchange of power where you're not using compassion or love or vulnerability to advance. You're not winning an argument by convincing someone of what you're saying. You're threatening to beat them up or fail them or, exclude them. So I think that it can be both sexes. I guess I would just say as a straight white guy in my life, when I see the violence and the danger, it usually is a guy that is quicker to inflict damage. But that's being said, the bullying thing is very real.
Absolutely. And I appreciate the question. And I acknowledge that particularly adolescent teenage girls can be quite vicious to each other. The difference that I see in toxicity among boys and toxicity among girls is that for amongst boys or men, toxicity is I don't know if the word tool is correct here, but it is a means by which a boy or a man is seen as more manly. So the 15-year-old boy that's bullying another kid at school is doing that to project an image of himself out there in the world that other people see as, oh, he's a real, badass dude or something, I don't know, which means more masculine. I don't think girls that participate in the same act are doing so because their end goal is to seem more feminine. So that's the difference that I see. And it has to do with that power relationship. I'm not saying it doesn't make them more popular. And then that begs the question of, how masculinity is kind of intertwined with social capital and stuff like that. Women acting masculinely maybe gives them a little bit of social cachet amongst their peers. But I don't think it makes them any more feminine. I think those are two separate conversations. There's a quote by a gender theorist whose name escapes me right now, but it's something along the lines of masculinity means more to men than femininity means to women. And it's because there's this, when I teach this, I draw like a line on the whiteboard and I put like masculinity over there and femininity over there, as if they're these polar opposites, just for the sake of this argument. And we try to imagine like the most masculine man that you can imagine. I don't know, for those of us that grew up in the 80s and 90s, you would think of like somebody like Rambo or, you know what I mean? Some Sylvester Stallone and Arnold Schwarzenegger, those type of guys. And then we do the same thing for the feminine side. Who's the most feminine? And the students have a much harder time. And it's because it doesn't matter, because anything less than Rambo, if you're moving left on my little diagram, you're becoming more feminine. So there is no like epitome of femininity in our society. There is an epitome of masculinity. And all of us that identify with being male and identify with being masculine, we all fall short of Rambo or whoever that happens to be. I don't even know if you students in the classroom know who Rambo is. I'm dating myself. There's somebody else out there for you guys. I don't know who it is, but I think that's what it is. I think boys participate in that act to be more masculine in the eyes of the people who are watching. But women participate in that act for a different reason. Maybe to become more popular, but not to become more womanly or more feminine. I don't think so. I can't say that with all 100% certainty, but I don't think so. Great question. Logan, did you have a question?
There's gonna be like a lot of things floating around the room right now. And the same thing for I'm a student. I'm 29 years old. I'm not good like I don't have the same aspects that a traditional student would have, being ingrained with social media or partaking in activities outside of the campus. I come here, I go home. I spent close to a decade in an all-male institution, and toxic masculinity, I was the epitome of toxic masculinity in every which horrible way that hurts and disenfranchises others by inherently trying to prove my masculinity. In coming to Shenandoah, and not just Shenandoah, because it's the professors that change the perspective and the dialogues that can happen, whether it's with somebody's brother or somebody's uncle, or even somebody's aunt, in whichever way, it can come down to a point of why or what led you to think this way, and holding enough space for them to respond and share their story in order to hear, as opposed to projecting a certain ideal or what's happened. Because when it comes to learning and outlining what toxic masculinity looks like or is, it comes down to, at an educational standpoint, of showing how that cake is baked, all the recipes that go into it, and then at the end you say, this is an awful cake. This is a poisonous cake that I don't want to eat. Why would anyone want to eat this? But we're all eating it. We're all consuming it. So then there's that concept of woke. And even if somebody wants to call me toxic, I'd probably get defensive in some way. If someone was to say, you know what, the way that you're thinking isn't woke, or you're not looking out for somebody else, they'd probably get defensive. So in that projection, trying to hold enough space to both hear from a learning perspective of, I don't know everything, so I should probably go seek what I don't know and how to deal with it, and understand that the cake that is made and the steps that took place to get there aren't benefiting anyone, but I've been eating it still. So toxic can be a very difficult word to try and get somebody's point across, as opposed to something like accountable masculinity in some way. So in a sense of saying that women or teenage girls can be very hostile, or they can be this, or they can be that, is that passing off an accountability of some sense? Is that looking away from what is happening with males or boys as they're developing their idea of masculinity, to try and flip it and say, well, girls are pretty awful as well, and girls are making and having to make this bargain to survive, to live in the man's world. This is something that is taught them, and they eat it with the cake, because everyone's been making the same cake. Their parents have been making them eat the same cake. Their grandparents have been making them eat the same cake. So as they eat it, they say, oh, if I want to do anything, then I eat the cake, and then I am now being, as someone would say, toxic or volatile or vicious, describing whether it's somebody who identifies as another gender than themselves. But in those ways, like some of that stuff can be very difficult as we're talking about toxic masculinity, to then devoid accountability from what's happening. Because whether if it's toxic or if it's just accountable, those two are the same things. You hold men accountable for what they are doing, for their behavior, then you wouldn't have these toxic outcomes of trying to point at a scapegoat or a red herring, or looking at young women and blaming them for their dress code in some way. Oh, it's their problem. Or teenage girls are really bad as well. So I think that's a great place, especially that a lot of older men understand. I understand morals, and I understand responsibility. What do you know about it? No. That's a place of the student's perspective.
Thanks for that comment, Logan. I think that speaks to the pervasiveness of these gendered identities that are prescribed to us from birth. The way you put it, the cake, the ingredients haven't changed and it's a toxic cake, but we're all eating it. Yes, everything everywhere is tied up into masculinity in this society that we live in. I see a hand in the very back.
Sorry, guys. Please.
I'll try to keep my question. Here it seems a lot of toxicity kind of like stems from this idea that like people don't account for it, right? And I know I've experienced this a lot in like discussions with like some of these people. For instance, my parents. And they outright how then
I mean, I'll start by saying it's hard work, right? And I think, speaking for myself, being available for the dialogue is half the battle, and understanding that perhaps progress or change is not possible is providing yourself a grace in that exchange. What I'll simply say, because I think it's a great question, and I don't have the answer. What I will say, and I'll go on record as saying, I'm not satisfied with saying, yeah, some people are not reachable. F them. There has to be a better way to try to engage. And what I think, looking at the state of like our socio-political kind of discourse right now, I think both sides, can't believe them, but both sides are very unwilling to give an inch. And I think certain amount of dialogue can at least be initiated if we, and I'm going to just say we in the sense of the people that are advocating for inclusivity and advocating for empathy, if we're willing to hear the stories or try to understand where someone's coming from, maybe there doesn't need to be a transaction. Like, I'm going to listen to you, and then you need to listen to what I have to say. I do think some of this anger we're talking about, it's not to excuse it whatsoever, but I do think there's a segment of our society that does feel unheard, which is crazy when we think about social media and everyone has a bullhorn now. You can shout from the rooftops digitally, but I think people feel unheard, and that the world is moving fast. The things we talked about, the changes that are occurring, all for the better. But there are people that feel like the world's changing and I'm being left behind. I think if we are able to give those people some grace and hear where they're coming from, they may be a little less defensive when we talk about where we're coming from. I think that's a start. Probably not satisfactory, but I believe that, as I said earlier, progress traditionally is slow. So if we're willing to go slow, I think we can take some wins, but it's not a zero-sum game, and I don't think it ever will be.
It's a great question, and thank you for it. We've been talking a lot up here about toxic masculinity, and there's another toxicity that is gaining a lot of steam amongst our society right now, which is toxic positivity. So I'm going to acknowledge that I tend towards toxic positive. Well, I don't know if it's toxic, but I tend to be positive. So what I would encourage someone expressing the idea that you are expressing would be don't discount the likelihood that you are having an impact on a family member who happens to not want to change, or who happens to push back on every single thing that you tell them or want to talk to them about. Don't lose sight of the real possibility that you're the one planting the seed. Maybe somebody else will come along to water that seed, or maybe not. To get to the point that Sean was trying to make, maybe it's like some people are just gonna dig their heels in even more when you challenge them. But I've seen it in my own family. Some particular family members who, I'm thinking of my uncle right now, who's from Mexico and very, very traditionally, patriarchally Mexican. Well, he happened to have two grandsons. One came out as gay, and the second one is trans. She is now, well, she was born Raven, but anyway, transition, my little baby cousin. And I see the love that my uncle now freely expresses with these two grandchildren of his. And to me, I go back in my mind, I'm like, I remember when he wouldn't entertain the idea that Michael might not be straight. Back when Michael was 13 years old or 14 years old. And I mean, he dug those heels in, and change happens very slowly. And I think the seeds were planted for my uncle many, many years ago, and they've been watered by someone. And now, I mean, those grandkids of his, who are now adults themselves, but they, in many ways, are very, he is very proud of them now. So there's a likelihood there that these conversations you're having with your parents, or anybody who's having these conversations, don't discount the likelihood that's a seed that you're planting, and maybe it'll bear fruit at some point. But it's also not your responsibility to do that. That's on them. Growth is on all of us individually. If you're gonna just shut down everything that people say to you, that's on you. You can't reach some people, like the woman at the voting polls that day. I looked at her and I said, you're not going to change my mind, and I'm fairly certain I'm not going to change yours. So keep yelling if you'd like. I'm going to go sit back down. And she walked away.
Good stuff. So how about this? I feel like we've covered some great ground, to be continued, but the pizza's here. Why don't we eat some pizza and we can continue to answer questions or talk, but I want to make sure everyone gets some pizza. So let me thank Bryan for being here. Thank you all for coming. Like I said, the series will continue next semester. Let us know if we missed anything, send us an email. Let us know what you want us to talk about. But for tonight, thank you. Questions, comments, let's keep them flying, but let's eat some food. Thanks, everybody.